Okay, Andres, so we have 15 people as of now. I guess that we can start this webinar. So go ahead, please.
Listo. A ver, buenas tardes a todos los que nos acompañan en este miércoles actuarial de septiembre, organizado por la Asociación Colombiana de Actuarios. Eh, pues es un gusto para mí que hoy nos acompaña Ryan Begg, coordinador del programa de pronósticos de Metaculus. Y esta es la primera vez que la Asociación Colombiana de Actuarios, la ACA, realiza un torneo de pronóstico, en este caso para la variable del salario mínimo, de cuánto va a aumentar del 2025 al 2026. Este torneo se realiza en asocio con Metaculus. El salario mínimo es una variable muy relevante para la economía colombiana, para pues, diferentes segmentos, desde la construcción, por ejemplo, la vivienda de interés social, está indexada al salario mínimo. Hay muchas variables en la economía indexadas al salario mínimo y para muchos acá, pues del mundo asegurador o relacionados con el tema actuarial, a la industria aseguradora también la afecta de diferentes maneras. Entonces, por ejemplo, la mano de obra en los talleres, en los seguros de automóviles, los gastos médicos de pólizas de salud o de SOAT también pues, están relacionados con el salario mínimo. Los pasivos pensionales también, todas las pensiones en Colombia como mínimo pues son de salario mínimo. Es decir, hay tanto, entre comillas, pros y contras de que el salario mínimo suba más o menos pues, de lo que uno se espera. Y ha resultado ser una variable pues, pues difícil de pronosticar. Y entonces se nos ocurrió eh, hacer uso de la herramienta y la plataforma de Metaculus que hoy Ryan nos va a explicar en qué consiste esta herramienta, que a futuro podríamos utilizarla como para pronosticar o monitorear expectativas de la gente frente a diferentes variables y pues creo que es una herramienta más para tener en nuestra caja de herramientas al momento de gestionar diferentes riesgos. Entonces me va a pasar el resto de la presentación es en inglés y pues les agradezco a todos los presentes el interés. Agradecería que difundieran el torneo. Creo que entre más personas participen, pues más creíble puede que sea el pronóstico y pues creo que es una gran oportunidad de aprender de algo diferente. So, ahora me paso a inglés. Welcome everybody and uh, now I give the word to Ryan Beck and thank you very much for assisting.
Thank you, Andres, and thank you for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Cool. So like Andres said, I'm Ryan, Forecasting Program Coordinator at Metaculus, and I'm excited to be here and grateful to the ACA for getting a chance to talk to you about how Metaculus has partnered with the ACA to do a first of its kind forecasting tournament on the predicting the minimum wage in Colombia. So here's a kind of an overview of what we'll go through. We'll kind of go over some of the details about how Metaculus works, what it is exactly, and why we think our approach is valuable for predicting the minimum wage in Colombia. So we'll start with some information about us, how it works, some difference between Metaculus and markets, like prediction markets, how we evaluate forecasts and forecasters, and then the details of what we're doing with the ACA and predicting the minimum wage in Colombia. So starting with a little bit of information about Metaculus. We're one of the world's most trusted forecasting platforms. We were founded in 2015. The gist of our approach is we use the wisdom of the crowd to aggregate a bunch of individual forecasts and track them over time. We became kind of a go-to resource during the COVID pandemic. We had a lot of forecasting questions about COVID-19 and how it was expected to unfold. And I think this was a useful resource for a lot of people. And a lot of people were also interested in joining and making their own predictions about how COVID-19 would unfold. And then we further were a useful resource in the Russia-Ukraine war as well to help anticipate outcomes. And um, one of my kind of favorite anecdotes that came out of kind of that awful event was we had a forecasting question about whether Russia would invade Ukraine, and a user commented to say that based on our forecast, they left Ukraine ahead of the invasion and moved with their family. So that was kind of a nice takeaway, a nice kind of what we are hoping to achieve with exactly what Metaculus is as a public resource and a tool for organizations. Um, and we're nearing nearly 3 million predictions on the platform, as you can see in the graph here. It's slightly out of date, but we're getting close to that benchmark. So we've got thousands of questions on the platform on all kinds of topics. We view it as a public resource. All of these are publicly visible. People can come in and see what the forecasts say, and anyone can join up and forecast themselves and track how they perform. We also do a lot of work for clients and partners. We deploy our top forecasters to predict respiratory disease outcomes for the US CDC, Center for Disease Control and Prevention. That is kind of an annual thing we've had going on for the last couple of years, where our forecasters will make predictions about what will happen with COVID-19, RSV, and influenza, as well as other emerging diseases, measles, things of that nature. And we share regular reports with the CDC to help them prepare with their planning and update their publications for communication to practitioners. We also do an annual tournament for Bridgewater Associates where we identify top talent. They recruit the top forecasters from that tournament. This is very much aligned with kind of their merit-based recruiting approach. There's testing people on their ability to predict the future is a strong indicator that they'll be talented analysts and are able to reason about uncertain situations and what will happen. We also benchmark AI forecasting capabilities. We've been doing that since early 2024. This is kind of the ultimate test for benchmarking. If you followed AI capabilities development, you hear about the concerns about data leakage, making sure, is this test already in the training data? And then some benchmarks get saturated and no longer become useful. But being able to predict the future is kind of the ultimate test for AIs. There's no leakage that happens. This is all concerning events that happen in the future, and it's a good test of AI tools' ability to plan and reason about the future. So we've been tracking the performance of AI systems relative to each other, so you can not only see, if ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude is the best forecaster, or but also to see how they're comparing against human forecasters. We also do a lot more things. For example, indexes, like one of our recently launched US Democracy Index. The concept of an index is we take many different questions related to a topic. Like for in the case of the US Democracy one, it's certain like thresholds that might be risky if they were crossed, if the government started to erode certain norms or do certain things. And we weight and assemble these into kind of an overall metric tracking this, what people expect to happen with democratic norms. We also do quite a few tournaments, whether organized by partners, promoted by partners like the ACA is doing with us, but we also do some Metaculus initiatives that we think are a valuable public resource. We also publish reports and conduct engagements on forecasting particular issues for organizations or groups that are interested. So that was kind of a broad overview of what exactly we are. So we'll talk a little bit here about how exactly Metaculus works. So the core functionality of Metaculus is that we're an aggregation engine. We take many individual forecasts and we aggregate them into a more robust forecast. This is based on kind of like some of the wisdom of the crowd's research, backed by research conducted by people like Philip Tetlock, basically finding that if you aggregate a bunch of individual forecasters, the resulting aggregate forecast will tend to be quite a bit more accurate than any individual forecaster can do over the long run. So we track these forecasts over time. Every time a forecaster updates their forecast or a new forecaster joins and predicts on a forecasting question, the aggregate updates, and we track how that moves over time. This is a useful real-time information source. You can see how the forecasts change in response to recent developments or news. And then we score and develop track records for both the Metaculus aggregate forecast overall, as well as for each individual member of the Metaculus forecasting community, so that we can see and learn from their performance. We have a number of different forecasting question types that we can launch. So we have binary questions, which are just your basic yes or no outcomes. And then we also have continuous questions. This is like the one that we're doing with the ACA for the minimum wage, where you can input a distribution over a full range of outcomes. So in this case, 0% increase in the minimum wage to 20% increase, and forecasters can put probability across that and assign probabilities to all the different outcomes in the range. And then we also have multiple choice questions for selecting among a defined list of possible outcomes, and forecasters can assign probability to each predefined outcome. We also have conditional questions. These are very interesting because you're asking for forecasts under different scenarios. So if a binary outcome were to happen, if something were a binary question were to be resolved yes or no, what would be your forecast under each situation? For the example we have here, it's if Chinese leadership were to remain the same through 2030, will there be a U.S.-China war? Versus if that leadership were to change, what is the probability of a U.S.-China war? We also have question groups. These are collections of binary or numerical questions, and they're just basically grouped up and asked over different time periods, so you can see how trends unfold. Or we have groups of similar, related questions. So that was a bit about, exactly how Metaculus works. But now we'll dive into a bit more about how forecasters actually engage with the platform and how they make their forecasts. So first, the user interface itself. Anyone can sign up and make a forecast. It's open to everybody. And then you see these kind of when you're on a forecasting question itself, you have these inputs that you can interact with. In the case of a binary question shown on top, you're not just predicting will this happen yes or no. You're predicting probabilistically, and you can enter a range from 0.1% to 99.9% and enter your probabilities in that way. And then for continuous questions, which we show on the bottom, you have a pretty flexible input that you can add multiple components and express your probability distribution over a full range. And you're also allowed, if in the case where a range isn't necessarily bounded on one end, you can have an open bound and you can put some of your distribution outside and express that you have a certain probability that'll end up outside the range, for example. So that's a bit about like how it functions UI-wise, user interface. But a lot of the times when people are learning about what exactly Metaculus is, one of their first questions is, what exactly are forecasters doing, and how are they thinking about how they make their forecasts? And I think in very broad strokes, this can kind of be boiled down into the concept of inside view and outside view. So I'll explain what that is with an example from Daniel Kahneman and Dan Lovallo, their 1993 paper that kind of popularized these concepts of inside view and outside view. So in this paper, they describe how one of them, Kahneman, was in a group that was trying to develop a high school curriculum for a new subject to submit to the government of Israel. And he discussed with his group, and they wanted to better understand and estimate exactly how long they thought it would take them to complete the work. So they got together and independently made their forecasts, and their resulting forecasts ranged from 18 to 30 months to submit a draft to the Ministry of Education to be able to complete that draft. Kahneman wanted to investigate this a little further, so he talked to a member of the group who had some experience or was aware of other groups that have done a similar thing. And he asked, okay, well, how did these other groups do? What was kind of their timeline? How did that work out? And they were both shocked when they considered this, that the answer was that basically 40% of the groups they were aware of that had tried it never ended up actually submitting a draft. They didn't get that far. And of the ones that did submit a draft, the process to get to draft submission took between 7 and 10 years. So this is an example of inside view versus outside view thinking. Kahneman's group was thinking about the characteristics of their plan and their specifics. They thought they have a solid plan. They thought they had made good steps in the process already, and they think their team was very capable and experienced. But what they weren't thinking about is how it had gone for similar efforts in the past and trying to incorporate that data. And when they did think about that data, they realized, their team was not that exceptional, or there was really no reason to think that their team would do any differently than the other teams that they could think of that took, between 7 and 10 years or ultimately failed to submit a draft. So that's kind of the outside view thinking that's important to think about is what are the similar groups or characteristics that we should compare against when thinking about how things will play out this time. And broadly, that's what forecasters are doing when they make their forecasts on Metaculus. They are, many of them have seen the advice that is available for forecasters, which is to consider the outside view. And in many cases, they'll start from, looking at the data, looking at the trends, looking at how things played out in the past, and coming up with base rates or reference classes for the outside view. And then they'll consider the inside view, and they'll update their forecast, what the outside view would tell them based on the particulars of the situation, and what exactly might be different this time. And thinking about that outside view helps to avoid biases. Like I said, this is broad strokes. Every forecaster is different, but in most cases, they're kind of looking at the data and then they're adjusting based on characteristics of the situation. And ultimately, what they're doing is submitting subjective forecasts. So we do have some forecasters who will build models and make a modeling approach to arrive at their forecast. But by and large, most forecasters are thinking about the data, thinking about the inside view, and then subjectively just thinking in their heads, well, I think based on this information, here's how I would make my prediction. And surprisingly enough, when you take those forecasts and you aggregate them, the biases cancel out. Each individual is looking at different parts of the whole picture, and the aggregate produces a very reliable and robust forecast. So that was a bit about how exactly the forecasts are made. But then when comes time for scoring, every question on Metaculus will have a known outcome or resolution. These aren't just polls. We're not just asking people what they think and never following it up. We will, at the planned time, administrators will come in and look at the resolution criteria of the question, which set forth the rules by which the admins have to judge the question, and then the question will be resolved. In most cases, the resolution criteria are written to eliminate subjectivity. It can't be fully eliminated in all cases, but we try to be as objective as possible and try to track things that are, the real outcomes in the world that are measurable. And yes, and so then in this case, for example, what we're showing here, Brazil's unemployment rate is fairly straightforward. The resolution criteria just said, what will the official government source report, and then we resolve the question depending on whether the source is says the data is above or below the threshold. And then every question has forecasters receive scores. In this case, we're showing down at the bottom right the score for the community aggregate prediction, and I'll talk more about what exactly those scores are in a little bit. So now that I've talked a little bit about how exactly Metaculus works, I think a useful next thing to think about is what makes it different from a prediction market. I think many of us have heard of prediction markets like Polymarket or Kalshi, and it's very common for people who are new to Metaculus to not realize that they're quite distinct in a number of ways. So we'll talk a little bit about those distinctions. What Metaculus does at its core, like I said, is prediction aggregation. You enter exactly what you think will happen, or a full probability distribution, a probabilistic number. Individual forecasts are aggregated into the community forecast, and no money is required from a forecaster. They're not putting up any money. They're not placing any bets. They're simply predicting what they think will happen. We do have tournaments with prize pools, but again, there's no entrance fee or anything. Contrasting that with markets, a common setup for markets is to price from 0 cents to 100 cents. They'll price an outcome. They'll have a market outcome, an event outcome, excuse me. So for example, a 0 cent price would mean that the outcome has 0% chance of happening, and 100% price would mean 100 cent price would mean that the outcome has 100% chance of happening. So for example, if the price were 87 cents, that would mean the market is saying that there's an 87% chance that the outcome happens. With markets, what you're doing is bidding the price up or down. If you buy $100 worth of a yes outcome at a price of 87 cents, if at the end of the question it resolves yes, the value of each individual share will go to 100 cents, and you'll make a return on your investment from that increase from 87 cents that you purchased it at to 100 cents that it resolves at. You can also sell earlier. If the market were to move to 95% value, you can sell and make that profit without waiting for the outcome to happen. But what markets aren't doing is determining or showing what exactly each individual thinks. You can see how strongly the individual thinks the price should be higher or lower based on the size of their bet. That's kind of some signal, but it doesn't tell you, for example, if a forecast, a bettor bid it down, bet no, and thinks that the probability is actually 35 cents. There's no way of telling that. There are quite a few other key differences, and I'll go through a few of them. Markets don't have much incentive to correct at extreme probabilities due to transaction costs or low returns on investment. One example of this is for the 2024 Democratic primary election, Polymarket, one of the major betting markets, had Michelle Obama as a 7% chance of being the nominee for quite a long period of time. Despite other platforms and other, Metaculus itself having a much lower probability on Michelle Obama's chances. And a big reason for this is just that there's really not much money to be gained from bidding down 7%. You're 7% to 1% is not much of a return on investment, and then you're locking funds away for quite a period of time for a pretty meager return. Especially once you take into account any transaction costs involved. Markets also require tying up money. Like in that case, that's one of the reasons that it's not worthwhile to bid that down. But another example here is for the 2020 U.S. election, most of the volume traded on the presidential election was just in the month or maybe barely more than a month leading up to the election itself. You're not getting much early signal or much early trading volume. And we've checked into this, and this held up for the 2024 election on Polymarket as well. And again, this is just there's not really much incentive to tie your money up for so long, and so most of the alpha or most of the interest tends to be short-term interest, trying to benefit from fluctuations in the period prior to it. So this is why you won't see many forecasting questions on some major markets that are beyond a 2-year time horizon. Whereas on Metaculus, because you're just putting in probabilities and you're not tying up money, we are able to launch much longer term questions. We have some that would resolve decades from now, or even longer, 5 years, 10 years. And we also, because you're not tying up money, or you don't need to put in money to express your probabilities, we can launch private forecasting initiatives and engage a selection of pro forecasters and do more targeted things and projects. And as I said, Metaculus also allows you to see what each individual thinks in their full distributions, not just higher or lower than the market price. And in addition to this, we're able to do blind forecasting, because if you're in a market, you need to see what the market price is to know whether to bid it up or down. Whereas on Metaculus, we can say this question, the community aggregate is going to be hidden for 5 days or 5 months, however long you want it. And then you can have a period where nobody can see the aggregate prediction, and you're collecting just individual unbiased forecasts. And this is not something a market's typically able to do. Additionally, markets aren't solely about truth seeking. For example, they're often used for things like hedging. Cauchy, for example, describes hedging as a key use case for their market, which makes a lot of sense. If you're an investor or in a business and there's some key risk to your business that also has a Kalshi market on it, you can use that market to hedge against that risk and turn a risky situation into more of a win-win situation. However, if a market is being used primarily as a hedging vehicle, there's some concern that the market is going to be miscalibrated on its pricing. It's not going to reflect the actual pricing, but just be pushed down by people using it for hedging. Ideally, in a liquid market, you would see this correct itself. But again, it depends on the market, and it depends how liquid it is and what most people are using the market for. Another thing that Metaculus can do that's different than markets is we can weight views equally or by skill. In our aggregate, we can set how that's computed. Whereas on markets, bets are weighted by the amount of money that's put behind them. So whales can have an outside influence, whales being investors with a lot of capital. And this capital isn't really, the fact that they have access to this capital isn't really reflective of forecasting skill necessarily. They may have accumulated it through other means, and so then that gives them an outsized influence in moving the markets, and for better or for worse. Yeah. So ultimately, though, we think that Metaculus approach and the approach of markets are very beneficial and are good for different reasons. We are we're glad that markets are doing what they're doing. They provide a valuable resource and information. But yeah, we're also glad for kind of the distinctions that Metaculus has and the way that we're able to take different approaches and focus on different things and the flexibility we have to do quite a bit of different things. All right, so with that, some of that context about Metaculus overall, we'll move into exactly how we evaluate forecasts and forecasters. So yeah, I think track records are very valuable, and Metaculus, that's one of the key things Metaculus does is provide track records for individuals and for the community aggregate as a whole. We've probably all seen some notorious predictions, whether it's Elon Musk being highly optimistic about driverless Tesla, when it'll be fully driverless, how quickly that'll come, or the quip that some of us may have heard about how markets or pundits have predicted 9 of the last 5 recessions, which apparently is a bit outdated. This was first said by Paul Samuelson in 1982, and I guess the updated number is 13 of the last 7 recessions. So, I think we're all aware of things that cry wolf, and personally, I'm excited about what Metaculus is doing because I think having those track records is important. And too often, you see somebody crying wolf or making bold claims, and there's really no accountability held for it later on. Another recent example is the highly confident forecast during the Biden administration that a recession was going to hit, and even going so far as to say 100% probability that a recession was going to hit, and then that didn't end up materializing. So yeah, like I said, I'm very encouraged by and I really value that Metaculus is very track record oriented, and I think part of the culture we're hoping to build is one where people look at track records and evaluate claims based on how they've how that individual has done in the past, and part of how we evaluate track records is through leaderboards as well as overall Metaculus platform track records. So up there on the top, you can see the 2024 individual leaderboards. So we rank forecasters. Each of them get their own calibration curve, and very interestingly, we find that often kind of like the internet points or the having the reputational being able to brag about it is kind of a very strong motivator for folks that participate on Metaculus. They like to be right, and they like to show up high in the leaderboards, and even more so than just the prize money. In many cases, this is a very strong motivator. We track our Metaculus aggregate track record as well. That's shown on the right and in the bottom. So what you're seeing on the right there is a calibration curve. You can see on the x-axis, those are each section there represents a bucket of how often the Metaculus aggregate has predicted within that probability bucket. So like if any predictions of 50% from the aggregate would show up in the 50% bucket. And then on the y-axis shows how often those things actually resolved yes. So a perfectly calibrated forecaster, for example, would every time they say, when they say things have a 70% chance of happening, those things actually do happen 70% of the time. That would make a perfect line on the calibration chart. Metaculus has quite a good calibration. It's not perfect, but over thousands of questions, it is quite well calibrated. And you can see the full plot in the bottom of our score distribution. There's a kind of a downward tail toward negative scores because the scoring approach we use has a wider range of negative outcomes available, but on average, you can see that the forecasts are scored generally quite positively. They have a positive score. A key way that we get forecasters to make their predictions is through using proper scoring rules to incentivize them to predict their true beliefs. So with a proper scoring rule, the only way to optimize your score on average is to predict your sincere beliefs. So you can see that chart on the right there, that GIF from Wikipedia is showing in the vertical black bar, that is what a forecaster's true belief is. So at any given point, say at 50%, the curves are showing under different proper scoring rules how you would be rewarded if you predicted your true belief of 50% versus if you predicted a different forecast, say 75%. And you can see under all situations, the peak is at the true belief. So under these scoring rules, you're optimized. Your incentive is to predict your true belief. The green line on the bottom there represents log scoring, which is what Metaculus uses to score these questions. And we use a rescaled version of the log score. So we have two versions. One is the baseline and one is the pure score. The baseline score compares to a fixed chance. So for binary questions, this is 50% or a coin flip. It's basically like an ignorant prior or an ignorant forecast. If you knew nothing about a binary question and you just came to it and said, I'm just going to guess, you would probably predict 50%. So our baseline is relative to that ignorant prior. If you predicted 25% and the event actually happens, you would get a negative score, worse than ignorant 50% forecast. If you predict exactly 50%, you receive a score of 0. If you predicted 75% and it happened, you would get a positive score. You would do better than the ignorant 50% forecast. This can be thought of as kind of your personal score. It's not really comparing. It's not dependent on other forecasters, how they predicted. And this is a rescaled log score. We rescale because positive scores are more rewarding. Log scores are negative, and it can be discouraging. There's just psychological effects of showing negative scores on every question. So we rescale that to be positive, but it remains proper. And we also rescale to account for different question types. So binary questions under just a basic log score versus continuous questions under a basic log score would have very different ranges of possible outcomes, and they wouldn't be very comparable. You'd end up, if you just lumped them all together, you'd end up weighting continuous questions more than you weight binary questions. We also have the peer score, which this one does compare your predictions to all other predictions on the question. So your peer score is your average difference between your score and everyone else's scores on the question. And this one measures more how you stack up against the community. And every question gives both a baseline and a peer score for both each individual forecaster as well as for the community aggregate prediction. Another key thing we do is time averaging. So it's not just your last forecast that counts. We score your accuracy on average over the lifetime of the question. The one on the right is a real example of a question that I forecasted on. You can see the little orange dots on the timeline showing what my forecasts were. So ultimately, I got a negative peer score on this. I did worse than on average than most other forecasters, or than the average of other forecasters. And that's mostly driven by, in early May, I made a forecast of 25% while the community was at 50%, and it ended up resolving yes. Despite the fact that I later went on and updated my forecast to be close to the community, and then towards the end to be close to the outcome, those portions were close enough to the community that I wasn't differentiating very much, so my score was close to the communities, and my score ended up being outweighed by that poor 25% forecast in the early part of the question. So we score forecasters across the lifetime and test their ability to update and make good forecasts throughout the question. And had I left my 25% forecast and not updated it, I would have received a worse peer score, a much more negative peer score than I had actually received, as well as for my baseline score would have also been more negative. One exception is that for some tournaments we do spot scoring, where you could say take your forecast at May 6th, and it's just your standing forecast at that time, and it would just be my 25% versus the community's 50%, and your score is computed against every other forecast at that time, and that's how you'd get your peer score. So in that case, if we'd just done spot scores at May 6th on this question, I also would have gotten a much worse forecast because my forecast at that time wasn't very good. There's trade-offs for when we do time averaging versus spot scoring. Time averaging incentivizes forecasters to come back in and update their forecast, and that's very useful for most questions. And by default, this is what we do on Metaculus because we want it to be a real-time indicator and update over time as news happens. But in some special cases for tournaments, we'll do spot scoring where we care less about people updating and just care more about reducing the perceived burden or barrier to entering the question. More forecasters will likely join if they don't expect that they'll have to stick around and continue to update for a long period of time. They can just make a forecast and move on and then receive their scores later on. So with some of that context about broadly how we do scoring, an important detail to mention is how we do scoring for continuous questions. So for a continuous question, the score that you receive is based on the probability that is assigned to the outcome. It's the height of your probability density function, which is what those curves are that you're seeing in the graphs. So for example, on the seasonally adjusted non-farm payrolls question, the community forecast in green had much more probability on the resolution outcome of 236,000 than I did. So the community would have received a better score for their forecast at that time, quite a bit better score. Similarly, on the bottom right, you can see another example where in this case, we're demonstrating that medians don't really matter. So if the outcome was to be at that dashed line, it turns out my orange forecast is only 32,000 off. The median of my forecast is 32,000 off from that outcome, while the median of the green community prediction was 36,000 off. So my median was closer. However, that doesn't matter. It's what you put at the outcome. So we can see that the green community forecast has more probability assigned. The curve is taller at the outcome than mine, and the community would receive a better forecast for that. So the takeaway here is that the full distribution matters and tail probabilities matter. So forecasters are incentivized to not just, make a quick narrow forecast, but to think about what their tail probability should be and try to be accurate across their full distribution. So we take these scores, and in many cases, not every question is in a tournament. Many questions are just launched onto the platform in general, but we do operate quite a few tournaments where we rank forecasters based on their scores across all the questions in the tournament. We've put a lot of thought into how we design these to be incentive aligned. To be consistent with proper scoring, it means we have to distribute prizes so that forecasters are incentivized to predict their true beliefs. You could imagine a scenario where the winner of a tournament gets all the prize. All of the prize goes to first place and nobody else gets any prize. In expectation, forecasters who join the tournament would expect to win no prize. They would be highly unlikely to get first place. So from that perspective, there's no downside for them to take risks and not predict their true beliefs, to take risky gambles and try to get first place. It increases your chance of a worse placement on average. If you try to do that, you will get ranked worse, quite a bit worse, but it might slightly increase your probability of getting exactly first place. So that's why we think carefully about how to design the structures and incentives so that people are incentivized to predict not just their true beliefs from our scoring, but also from how we distribute prizes and how our tournament structure is set up. So our system is essentially proper with a sufficient number of independent questions, and your prize is proportional to your score. So widening your lead over the field or second place increases your share of the prize. You can see here this recent tournament that ended, our summer 2025 Metaculus Cup. The top two forecasters had very, very similar total scores, and that led to them having a very similar prize distribution. It wasn't weighted too heavily at the top. However, if the top forecaster Sergio had been, maybe several hundred points higher in total score, their prize would have been quite a bit higher than the second place person. And an especially interesting finding from tournaments that kind of backs the calibration we showed for the community earlier is that the wisdom of the crowd performs very well. The community prediction tends to place very, very highly in these tournaments. Top 5, top 3, top 1 in the case of the International Elections Hub. And yeah, like I said, this is just additional evidence that the community prediction, taking that aggregate of individuals, tends to do quite a bit better than any individual can do. And aside from keeping track of track records for transparency purposes and to foster a culture of transparency and reflection and evaluation, and in addition to just keeping evidence that our forecasts are reliable, a key thing we're doing with these track records is identifying top forecasting talent. So we recruit pro forecasters who have robust track records over many questions and who have also demonstrated that they can clearly describe their reasoning on their forecasts and explain exactly what they're thinking. And we recruit them as Metaculus pros and we deploy them on client and partner engagements. This way we can get flexible and quick forecasts with clear reasoning accompanying them on questions that organizations care about or certain projects. We can deploy them on private questions on the platform where it's not visible to the public, and they can generate insights for clients who don't want the information that's being forecasted to be revealed publicly. And an important thing here is this ensures that we get reasoning accompanying the forecast, and we build this reasoning into reports that we publish. Often what clients and partners want is not just the number. The number itself is interesting. The probability is certainly interesting. But the why of it is almost as interesting or maybe even more useful in some cases. It turns kind of just a number that's informative into something that's maybe more actionable because you can see what the considerations are that are impacting it, and if there's anywhere where you could influence the outcome. Yeah, and so we take this output and we publish reports. For example, one of our recent reports that we published last week was for National Institutes of Health and National Science Foundation. We published this for a client that wanted to predict what the NIH and NSF funding and spending will be over the next few years. This is an important consideration for research, for the research community, as well as for funders in the space of science and research funding to know where they could best allocate their funds. So with all of that background and context, I think now we can move into exactly what we're doing for the Columbia Wage Watch with the ACA, and talk a little bit about our approach here. So Metaculus has partnered with the ACA to forecast the December 2025 Colombian minimum wage decision that will influence, or that will be effective for 2026. The ACA has provided a $1,000 prize pool to incentivize forecasters to predict on the question. And the aim and goal of this is to be a public source of information so that folks can better anticipate what the outcome and effects of the decision. Like I said, I think it's a valuable early source of information. We check the weather forecast before we go outside to see if we need an umbrella, or before we plan an outdoor event. So why wouldn't we do the same for such a large decision that impacts wages, housing subsidies, traffic fines, pensions, health cost sharing, and more? This is an important thing that people will learn about in December. They'll learn the final outcome, but we can help them prepare before then. And hopefully that leads to less surprise. The way we've structured this is five winners from the tournament will each receive $200. We put this this is based on the peer score. The best peer scores will receive those prizes. And we went with this flat structure, which is different from our normal tournament structure because it's only one question. So we wanted to eliminate or reduce the risk of extremization. of folks predicting, not their true belief just to try to win. So it's kind of an unusual setup, but it's still hard to game. And with a large number of forecasters, we expect that this incentive structure will lead to good forecasts. The question is accepting forecast through the end of December, and it'll resolve as soon as the announcement is made by the government of what the minimum wage will be set. You can see here we've got precise resolution criteria like we do for all our questions that specify exactly how the percentage increase will be calculated, and including details in the fine print such as that it excludes the mandatory transportation allowance. It's strictly the minimum wage increase. So with all that said, this is what the forecast looks like so far. It launched at the end of August. 117 forecasters have participated, which is quite a solid number. I just looked at the stats, and about 25% of those forecasters joined after the question launched. So 75% or so are kind of have been around Metaculus or veteran forecasters, and the question has brought in 25% of those roughly are new forecasters who are interested in the topic and joined and made their prediction on this. The median started out at the end of August at around 8%, and has risen to about 9.2%. The distribution currently is the 25th percentile forecast is 7.8% increase, and the 75th percentile is 10.6%. So the 50% range is spanning roughly 3 points, and there's still a decent amount of weight in the tails. For forecasters are giving the aggregate is giving a 10% chance that the minimum wage will increase by more than 13%. Yeah, and I've screenshotted here one of there've been a couple really nice in-depth comments from users explaining their thinking on the forecast and why they think it's gonna, or what exactly they think are the contributing factors and what's at play, and we always welcome more of that kind of analysis and reasoning in the comments. We think comments are a public good, and we hope they're useful to other forecasters and for people trying to understand the forecasts. Yeah. So to sum up, I think Metaculus provides a valuable way to get calibrated forecasts that can be useful for an organization or the world. The community aggregate has demonstrated excellent accuracy. Track records are not only valuable for building a culture of learning and evaluation. Personally, when I was starting out forecasting, seeing my forecast, seeing my scores, and not just making a forecast and forgetting about it, that was super valuable. There's nothing. It's easy in hindsight to say, oh yeah, I probably thought this certain way, or shift exactly what your framing was in hindsight. But it's much harder when you're presented with a score of -50 and you realize, oh, I need to think more carefully about this in the future. I should learn from this. But yeah, in addition to those kind of benefits, it also helps us identify top forecasters and be able to run projects where we have top forecasters make their predictions and share their reasoning. And it's a very flexible approach that can help shed light on a lot of important topics, and we're really excited to be partnering with ACA to kind of help the public better prepare and provide this resource that can help anticipate what the minimum wage decision will be in December. Yeah. So with that, any questions?
O si quieren hacer las preguntas en español también y las traducimos. Algo que me parece muy interesante es, le entendí a Ryan, digamos, me acabo de enterar de eso, que de los 117 pronosticadores que hay actualmente, solamente el 25% son nuevas personas que, sí, o sea, que se registraron pues a partir de que inició el torneo. Es decir, 75% son usuarios, pues pensaría usuarios de Metaculus, lo cual me parece interesante porque es como una visión, pues probablemente de gente de fuera del país que puede ayudar a hacer tal vez más robusto este pronóstico. So I was saying, Ryan, that I find it very interesting that if I understood well, 75% of the current forecasters were already signed up to Metaculus. So that means that most of the forecasters today are probably not from Colombia, but from the Metaculus community, which probably makes more robust this forecast. And this is like a surprise for me. I was expecting most of the people to be just Colombians. So yeah, I think it's one of the nice things of this kind of platform that has worldwide reach.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very interesting too. There's trade-offs there. You know, I think Colombians might have insights that are interesting there, but they also might have their own biases that could skew things. And then, you know, our forecasters may not have any special insights into Colombia itself, but you know, they've had a lot of practice and they've predicted on a lot of things, so they'll have kind of that experience to make those forecasts. So yeah, I was glad to see that there was, you know, 25% of them were newer forecasters, most likely from, you know, Colombia or around the area. So I'm glad that those perspectives are, you know, being included in the aggregate.
Okay. There's a question. I don't know if Andres Torres wants to expand a little bit more. I don't understand it very well.
Yes, maybe I can clarify a little bit, asking directly. It was a little bit confusing when you were explaining how the forecasting worked. For what I understood, for other tournaments, what you predict is the probability of each individual increase. For example, in this case, what it would look like, and for this case, we only would predict, or we would make our predictions on the average on the percentage itself, right? Not the whole distribution. I got a little confused. Sorry.
Yeah, let me go back to that and try
Okay.
to explain and see if this
Thank you.
makes more sense. So the distribution up there on the right, that's showing the full probability distribution of what folks are predicting. So that central line there is at 9.2%. So that's the median prediction,
Okay.
the median of the aggregate. But yeah, so you can see the full distribution there. So the central expectation is 9.2%, but you know, there's certainly probability assigned to outcomes above 10%, and some probability assigned to much higher outcomes as well.
Okay. I got it. Thank you.
Concerning the number of forecasters, is 100 forecasters like a relatively good number for it to be robust, or
yeah, that's quite good.
more people will add up to the tournament, but is this already a good number or not?
Yeah, a common rule of thumb we have is like we start to put weight on and consider a forecast fairly more reliable when it has like at least 10 forecasters, and as it climbs from there, the aggregate gets more robust. There are diminishing returns. You know, once you're in the realm of like 30 forecasters, you're already quite robust, and things are, you know, you can add more reliability as you add more forecasters, but it diminishes pretty quickly just how much. We've have some research that I could find that has talked about how exactly, you know, how accuracy changes with respect to the number of forecasters. I'd be happy to share. But yeah, in this case, for many questions that are just launched on Metaculus that, you know, aren't part of a tournament or whatever, we might expect maybe 10 to 20 forecasters. Tournaments tend to have, you know, 50 to 100 or more, depending on the size of the tournament or how interesting it is. So yeah, I think 117 is quite good, and I think you know, we at Metaculus would consider the aggregate forecast very robust.
Okay, any more questions? ¿Alguna otra pregunta? Vengan.
No, señor.
La grabación la idea es poderla subir pronto, creo que a YouTube, y pues sí, agradeceríamos si comparten esta información. Como pues ven, no tiene ningún costo participar. Uno no solamente hace un pronóstico, sino que puede actualizarlo tan seguido como quiera, y de hecho es como lo que debería hacer porque al final el puntaje se calcula con base como en el promedio ponderado, pues a lo largo del tiempo. Entonces uno todos los días si quiere puede ir actualizando a medida que, pues no sé, se van desarrollando las noticias o va cambiando las perspectivas. Desde la Asociación de Actuarios también, digamos que bienvenidos si quieren escribir, pues en la página del torneo pues está el link de la asociación, que en todo caso es actuarios.org.co. De pronto para futuras oportunidades, pues bienvenido cualquier sugerencia, digamos como de otras variables relevantes pues que uno quisiera monitorear, que pues, de pronto los métodos actuariales pues no se prestan casi. Entonces, bienvenidos los comentarios. Yes, so Ryan, I think this will be it. And thank you very much for the explanation. I was saying that we will upload the video to YouTube. We will keep on sharing this information, and hopefully more people participate. We are still relatively early in the minimum wage discussion, even though, but although every couple of days there's something in the news, but probably in a couple of weeks it will become a very important topic here in Colombia. So thank you again, Ryan, and thanks to Metaculus for the partnership and your clear explanation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it. And if there's any follow-up questions anyone has, or anyone wants a copy of the slides or anything, my email's on the screen. I appreciate it.
Right. Maybe I have a question. I saw that one can download the forecasts, and but I haven't looked into it that much. But it seems to me that one can see the individual forecasts of everybody, not just the not just the aggregate forecast. Or
I believe if it's working correctly, it should be just the aggregate. But yeah, I'll follow up with you and see if that is not the case, because yeah, if not, we might need to double check that.
Because it seemed to me that there was relatively a lot of information in the file you download.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for letting me know. I'll look into that and see.
Okay. Thank you very much again, Ryan. Y bueno, muchísimas gracias a todos, a Edwin. Y pues bueno, pues vamos a participar.
Gracias a todos. Feliz noche. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank
Have a
you.
good night.
You too.
Gracias, hasta luego. Good night. Thank you very much, Ryan.